You probably have a bottle of 3% hydrogen peroxide sitting somewhere under your kitchen sink right now. And if you are like most people, you only remember it when someone gets a small cut or scrape. That is exactly the mistake I made for years, and I never realized how much time and money I was wasting. Because I kept buying different cleaners, plant products, and expensive household solutions for problems that one simple bottle could help with. I am not saying it is some miracle liquid, because it is not, and I do not believe in miracle products. But I learned a long time ago that many older people used simple things every week instead of filling their shelves with expensive bottles that all promised the same results. Once I started paying attention, I found myself reaching for hydrogen peroxide more often than almost anything else in the house and around the garden. The funny part is that nobody ever really talks about these everyday uses anymore. Most people either ignore it completely or use it in ways that do not actually help, because they skip one small detail that makes all the difference. That is why I wanted to sit down with you today and simply share what has worked for me over many years. Nothing complicated, nothing expensive, just practical habits that save money and solve common problems without making life harder. Over the next few minutes, I will show you how I use this little bottle in places where most people would never think to use it. Some of these methods help keep things cleaner around the house. Others make everyday gardening a little easier. A few of them were shown to me many years ago by people who hated wasting money and believed that simple solutions were often the best ones. I still remember thinking some of these ideas sounded too ordinary to matter until I tried them myself and saw the difference with my own eyes. But before we get into the first method, there is one mistake that almost everyone makes with hydrogen peroxide, and if you do not understand this first, then the rest of these ideas will never work as well as they should. That one small detail changes everything, and it is where we will begin next. The biggest mistake most people make with hydrogen peroxide is thinking that if a little works, then more must work even better. I used to believe that myself until an older neighbor smiled and told me that simple things only stay useful when you respect them, instead of trying to turn them into something they were never meant to be. Since then, I have always kept an ordinary bottle of 3% hydrogen peroxide on hand and used it for simple everyday jobs without trying to make it solve every problem in the world. That change in thinking saved me money, because I stopped buying special products for every little task around the house. It also saved me time, because I always knew exactly where to reach when something needed attention. One place where I began noticing the difference was around small garden tools. After working in damp soil, it is easy to put a trowel or pruning shears away without thinking. A few days later, you see dirt sticking to the metal and little spots beginning to appear. Most people simply wipe the tools with water and put them back again, but that often leaves moisture behind. I started spraying a little hydrogen peroxide onto a clean cloth and wiping the metal surfaces before drying them well. It became part of my routine, and over time my tools stayed cleaner and were much nicer to use. It only takes a minute, but very few people bother doing it. The same habit helped with seed trays and plastic pots before planting season. Instead of buying another cleaner every spring, I would rinse away the loose dirt, then use hydrogen peroxide on the surfaces and let everything dry before filling the containers again. It was simple and inexpensive, and I always felt better starting the season with clean equipment instead of carrying old dirt from one year into the next. Most people rush through this step because they are excited to start planting, but I learned many years ago that taking a little extra time at the beginning often saves much more time later. There is another place in the house where I quietly use this same bottle, and almost nobody guesses it because it has nothing to do with the garden. In fact, it solved one small everyday problem that kept coming back until someone shared an old practical trick with me, and that is the next thing I want to tell you about. One habit that has stayed with me for years is using hydrogen peroxide in places where moisture always seems to collect. About the kitchen sponge, the dishcloth, and even the small brush I use after working with vegetables from the garden. Most people simply rinse these things under the tap and believe they are clean enough. I used to do exactly the same until I noticed that after only a couple of days, they would start to smell even though they looked perfectly clean. That smell was my reminder that water alone was not solving the problem. An older friend showed me a very simple routine that cost almost nothing. After washing the sponge or cloth, I would pour a little 3% hydrogen peroxide over it, let it sit for a few minutes, then rinse it well and allow it to dry completely. It became such an easy habit that I stopped thinking about it. The kitchen felt fresher and I was replacing sponges much less often because I was taking better care of them instead of throwing them away every time they started smelling unpleasant. It is one of those little things that many people overlook because it seems too simple to matter. I have learned that the simplest habits are often the ones that stay with you for years because they fit naturally into everyday life. The same idea followed me into the garden shed. Every season I use small containers for seeds, watering cans, and plastic buckets. Before putting them away or using them again, I like to clean them first instead of leaving old dirt and plant residue behind. I never rush this step because experience has taught me that a clean start usually makes the rest of the season easier. I am not trying to make everything look perfect. I simply like knowing that I am starting with equipment that has been cared for. Many people spend money replacing things that could have lasted much longer, with a few extra minutes of attention. That is something I learned from older gardeners who hated unnecessary waste. They believed that if you looked after your tools and your home, then those things would serve you well for many years. But there is another use for hydrogen peroxide that surprised me even more, because it involves something almost every gardener struggles with sooner or later. I ignored this old method for a long time because it sounded too ordinary to make any difference, until I finally decided to try it for myself, and the result was much better than I expected. One of the most useful lessons I ever learned was that healthy plants usually begin with healthy roots. Most people spend all their attention looking at the leaves because that is the part they can see. If the leaves start turning yellow, they immediately buy fertilizer. If the growth slows down, they buy another bottle from the garden center. I used to do exactly the same until an older gardener looked at me and said that the real story is almost always happening below the soil. That simple sentence stayed with me. Since then, I have paid much more attention to the roots than the leaves. One practical way I use 3% hydrogen peroxide is when I have young seedlings growing in small containers. Every now and then, I check the soil carefully. If I notice it has stayed wet for too long because of rainy weather or because I simply watered a little too often, I know the roots need better conditions rather than more fertilizer. At that point, I sometimes prepare a very diluted mixture of hydrogen peroxide and water and use it only as an occasional watering for the soil. I never make it stronger than needed, and I never use it every week, because this is not something that replaces good watering habits or healthy soil. It is simply one small tool that can be helpful in certain situations when the growing conditions have not been ideal. Many people make the mistake of thinking they have discovered a magic formula, and they start pouring it onto every plant all season long. That is where they go wrong. The old gardeners who taught me these ideas never believed in using anything more often than necessary. They believed the garden should solve most of its own problems through healthy soil, good drainage, and patience. Hydrogen peroxide was only there as an occasional helper, not the main solution. I have noticed that after using this simple method at the right time, my seedlings often recover their fresh appearance more quickly and continue growing without the stress that comes from constantly sitting in overly wet soil. That is why I always tell people not to chase quick fixes. Look at what caused the problem first, and only then decide whether this little bottle has a place in the solution. Very few people take that extra moment to think before acting, and I believe that is why they often become disappointed. There is another use that impressed me even more because it has nothing to do with seedlings. It involves ordinary vegetables that most of us wash in the kitchen after coming in from the garden, and once I started doing it this way, it quietly became part of my routine every harvest season. One thing I always look forward to during harvest season is bringing fresh vegetables into the kitchen, but that is also when I remember another old habit that has stayed with me for years. When tomatoes, cucumbers, peppers, or leafy greens come straight from the garden, they often carry tiny bits of soil, dust, or whatever the wind has left behind. Most people simply rinse everything under cold water for a few seconds and believe the job is finished. Sometimes that is enough, but sometimes I like to spend one extra minute because I know how much work went into growing that food. I prepare a bowl of clean water with a small amount of 3% hydrogen peroxide mixed into it using a mild dilution, let the vegetables sit briefly, and then rinse them thoroughly with fresh water before using or storing them. I never leave them soaking for a long time because there is no reason to do that. The whole idea is to keep the process simple and practical. This is not about making vegetables last forever or promising impossible results. It is simply one small habit that makes me feel more comfortable before putting fresh produce on the table. The same bottle often helps me with another job that almost every homeowner knows very well. Every now and then I notice small areas around window frames, outdoor flower pots, or damp corners where moisture has been sitting longer than it should. Instead of reaching for several expensive cleaning products, I often begin with hydrogen peroxide because it is already sitting on the shelf. I apply it carefully to the affected surface, allow it a little time to work, then wipe everything clean and let the area dry properly. That last step is the one most people forget. They clean the surface but leave the moisture behind, and before long the same problem returns again. Many years ago someone told me that cleaning without removing the reason for the problem is only half the job. I have never forgotten those words because they apply to almost everything in the house and the garden. Whether it is a damp corner indoors or a flower pot outside, the real goal is not just to clean what you see today, but to improve the conditions so the problem is less likely to come back tomorrow. There is one final way I use this inexpensive bottle that probably saves me more money than any of the others, because it changed how I think about everyday household products. And once you understand that simple idea, you may never look at this ordinary bottle the same way again. The longer I live, the more I realize that saving money is not really about finding the cheapest product. It is about buying fewer products because one simple item can handle several everyday jobs when you know how to use it properly. That is exactly how I think about a bottle of 3% hydrogen peroxide. I do not keep it because I expect miracles. I keep it because over the years it has quietly replaced several expensive products that I no longer feel the need to buy. Every time I walk through the cleaning aisle at the store, I see shelves full of brightly colored bottles promising incredible results. Years ago, I probably would have put 2 or 3 of them into my shopping cart without thinking twice. Now I usually smile and keep walking because experience has taught me that simple habits are often worth much more than clever advertising. That does not mean every expensive product is useless. Some have their place. But many everyday tasks around the home and garden can be handled with things that are already sitting on the shelf if we remember the practical knowledge that older generations passed down. I believe that is something we have slowly forgotten. We have become so used to buying another product every time a new problem appears that we rarely stop to ask whether we already have a simple solution at home. That way of thinking changed my daily routine. Instead of collecting dozens of bottles, I focus on keeping a few reliable supplies and using them wisely. It makes the shelves less crowded and it makes life feel less complicated. The same idea carries over into the garden. Healthy soil, regular observation, careful watering, clean tools, and a little patience usually accomplish much more than constantly chasing the newest product on the market. Hydrogen peroxide fits into that approach because it is only one small part of a much bigger picture. It supports good habits, but it never replaces them. I think that is why it has stayed in my home for so many years. It earns its place by being useful instead of impressive. Very few people talk about it this way because simple routines are not exciting enough to sell in glossy advertisements. Yet these quiet, everyday habits are often the ones that save the most money over time. Before we finish, there is one final thought I would like to leave with you because it ties together everything we have talked about today and explains why this ordinary little bottle still has a permanent place in both my kitchen and my garden. As I sit here thinking about everything we talked about today, I keep coming back to one simple idea that has served me well for many years. Life becomes easier when we stop looking for complicated answers to ordinary problems. A simple bottle of 3% hydrogen peroxide has never been the most impressive thing on my shelf, and it has never promised to change my life overnight. What it has done is quietly earn my trust through small, practical jobs that make everyday living just a little easier. It helped me care for my tools instead of replacing them too soon. It became part of my routine when cleaning pots and seed trays before a new growing season. It found a place in my kitchen when fresh vegetables came in from the garden. It reminded me that sometimes the oldest habits survive because they actually work instead of because someone is trying to sell them. That is the difference I hope you remember after watching this video. Do not think of hydrogen peroxide as a miracle product because it is not. Think of it as one useful tool among many that belongs in a well-organized home. The real secret has never been the bottle itself. The real secret is learning to observe your home and your garden carefully before rushing out to spend more money. Most small problems can be improved with patience, regular care, and simple routines that people have quietly used for generations. I believe that is one piece of old-fashioned wisdom worth holding on to. Every season I still learn something new, even after all these years, because nature has a way of reminding us that slow, steady habits usually bring the best results. If one of these simple ideas helps you save a little money, protect something you already own, or makes your gardening just a little easier, then sharing these experiences has been worthwhile. And I can promise you this is far from the only forgotten household habit that deserves another look. There are several more inexpensive methods that older gardeners and homeowners used almost every day before shelves were filled with specialized products. Some of them are even simpler than what we covered today, and a few still surprise me every time I use them. That is exactly what I would like to share with you next time, because sometimes the smallest ideas end up making the biggest difference in everyday life.